Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
The smell of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and candied yams floated thick through the air like a curtain of tradition nobody really questioned anymore. The house, my childhood house, was full of bodies. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, uncles and aunts who still pinched cheeks like they hadn't seen me in kindergarten, and the same folding chairs brought out from the garage every Thanksgiving like clockwork. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for the last 30 years, right down to the butter dish shaped like a pilgrim hat, and the cheap paper napkins with gold foil leaves. The illusion of warmth was almost perfect. Almost. Except now, I understood the choreography behind it. I could see the way my mother overcompensated, talking too loudly, smiling too brightly. I could see the tightness around my father's eyes as he laughed at jokes that didn't land. And I could feel, deep in my bones, that my presence had become something to be explained, not welcomed. I hadn't lived in this house in nearly 2 decades, not since I left for college and never looked back, except on holidays when guilt outweighed self-preservation. I had built a life far from here, one with long hours, complicated spreadsheets, government contracts, and phone calls that came at 3 in the morning from clients halfway across the world. I had my own apartment, my own bank account, my own company. But none of that fit inside the story my family told about me. To them, I was still the one who never really settled, who didn't believe in marriage, who works online doing something. I had long since learned it was easier to let them think whatever they needed to think. I didn't correct them when they assumed I had nothing going on. I let the jokes slide, let the condescension breathe, because it was easier to be underestimated than constantly defending my life. We were halfway through dinner when it happened. My fork had just pierced a slice of turkey when Uncle Rick, naturally loud, naturally smug, and naturally half-drunk, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that made my stomach twist. "She still lives off her parents, doesn't she?" he said, chuckling like he'd just cracked the best joke of the evening. His voice carried easily down the table, drawing eyes and half-smiles from those who didn't want to be caught laughing but couldn't help themselves. "No shame in it these days, I guess," he added, raising his wine glass as if that made it less offensive. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I'd heard worse from better people. I simply sipped my water, met his eyes once, then looked away. Let them think what they wanted. That was the unspoken agreement of these gatherings. They got to keep their illusions, and I got to keep my peace. But then my mother laughed. Not politely, not nervously, she actually laughed. And not just that, she leaned forward slightly, turned toward Rick, and with that tight little smile she reserved for when she thought she was saying something clever, she said, "Sweetie, she pays our mortgage." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd felt in that house before. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was the kind of silence that falls when a room collectively realizes that something foundational has just shifted. Even the clink of someone's fork slipping onto their plate rang out with unnatural clarity, like a punctuation mark nobody expected. I didn't move. My fingers froze around my fork. My chest didn't rise. It was like time had stretched, and everyone was too stunned to breathe. Uncle Rick's face, normally flushed with wine and bluster, went still, his mouth half open, eyes darting to my mother for confirmation. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just returned to her plate like she hadn't detonated a conversational landmine right in the middle of her holiday centerpiece. My father cleared his throat. Someone laughed awkwardly, probably Sarah, my cousin who always rushed to fill silences, even if she had no idea what she was laughing at. But it was too late. The curtain had been pulled back. The story had changed, and nobody knew how to rewrite it on the fly. My uncle recovered first. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice less certain now, more measured. "You joking, Diane?" My mother didn't even look up. "No, Rick. She's been helping us with the house for years. What did you think kept this place running after your investment advice left us 3 months from foreclosure?" And just like that, the last threads of polite holiday delusion snapped. The table turned toward me, faces flickering between shock, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite name. Pity, embarrassment, maybe even guilt. But I didn't speak. I hadn't asked for any of this. I hadn't needed the credit. I hadn't demanded the recognition. I had paid the mortgage, paid the taxes, paid the damn insurance, silently month after month, because they were my parents and because I could. The irony was sharp. All these years they thought I was being taken care of, when I was the one holding everything together. And still, they had treated me like an afterthought, like a shadow at the table. Good for rolling pies, but not much else. They never thought to ask how I lived, what I did, or what it took to survive on my own terms. They didn't know because they never cared to ask. But now the truth sat on the table, cold and unavoidable, like the untouched cranberry sauce congealing in its crystal bowl. No one spoke for the longest time. My cousin finally tried to change the subject. Something about her fiancé's job, or maybe their dog's allergy to grain. But the momentum was lost. The air had changed. And as I looked across the table, at my mother's calm expression, I realized something deeper than shock or pride. She hadn't said it to defend me. She had said it to warn me. She had put the truth on the table not because she was proud, but because she knew the house of cards she had built around our family was finally starting to lean. And she wasn't going to let it collapse quietly. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house didn't smell like turkey or stuffing or cinnamon anymore. It smelled like silence, that thick, guilty kind of silence that clings to the furniture and seeps through the drywall, the kind that makes every creak in the floor feel like a whisper behind your back. Nobody was talking about what happened at the dinner table, but nobody was talking about anything else either. My mother had disappeared into her usual rituals, polishing silver that didn't need polishing, folding dish towels that were already stacked in the drawer. And my father kept himself anchored behind the newspaper like it was a shield, even though I knew damn well he hadn't read a full article in years. The rest of the family had cleared out early, no doubt relieved to get out of that house before another bomb went off. Not a single cousin lingered for pie or late-night coffee. Nobody stayed behind to help with dishes. Uncle Rick, for once, didn't launch into one of his long-winded post-meal rants about how the country was going to hell or how kids these days couldn't change a tire. He had left with barely a grumble, his usual bravado tucked behind an unconvincing shrug as he muttered something about misunderstandings and clarifying later. But I wasn't interested in clarifying anything. I'd lived too many years pretending we were all just slightly dysfunctional instead of fully complicit. It would have been easier to let it all slide again, to let the tension cool off, to let Mom's comment get swallowed up by the next holiday or family wedding or new baby. That was the pattern. That was the Reynolds family contract. We didn't talk about anything real unless it could be joked about. We didn't name problems, we just hoped they'd die of old age. But something in me had shifted. Maybe it was the way my mother dropped that line like she was tired of carrying it alone. Or maybe it was the silence afterward, the way every face turned toward me, like I had suddenly become a mirror they didn't want to look into. I spent most of that morning in my childhood bedroom, which hadn't changed in the 2 decades I'd been gone. Same floral wallpaper, same scuffed desk, same bookshelf with every copy of the Babysitter's Club arranged in numerical order. My trophies, most of them for participation or effort, still sat on a high shelf like some kind of monument to all the things I never really cared about but tried anyway. The room was like a time capsule for a version of me that never got a say in who she wanted to be. I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder I kept tucked deep in a personal drive, labeled House Docs. Inside were PDFs of every mortgage statement, every property tax receipt, every bank transfer I had made over the last 4 years. I had kept everything, not out of paranoia or pride, but because I was raised by people who thought evidence was the same as power, and I had learned to keep mine close. The first payment I ever made on the house had been just over 4 years ago, right after my father called me late one night and said, with a crack in his voice I'd never heard before, that they were behind by 3 months and the bank had started making calls. At the time, I was coming off a brutal consulting contract that had drained me emotionally, but left me with a generous payout. I wasn't thinking about the long term when I offered to help. I wasn't thinking about power or manipulation or what it meant to keep that kind of secret. I was thinking about how hard my parents had worked, how much pride they had tied into this house, and how badly they would crumble if they lost it. I told myself it was temporary, a bridge loan between them and the next financial step. But months passed, and nothing changed. My father never got back on solid footing. My mother, for all her control over everything from dinner parties to holiday photos, never once brought up the money again. They didn't talk about it, so I didn't either. I just kept paying. I automated the process, tucked it away in a budget line like any other recurring cost. Rent for a life I wasn't living, but I never told anyone else. Not my cousins, not my friends, not even my therapist. Because deep down, I was ashamed. Not of helping, but of being taken for granted. I had slipped so quietly into the role of provider that no one even noticed I had stopped being the child in the family. And once that silence settled in, it became impossible to break without sounding like I wanted something in return. Until now. Later that afternoon, I went downstairs to make tea, and my mother was at the sink, rinsing plates that had already been washed twice. She didn't look up when I walked in. She just kept her back to me, her shoulders tight, like she was waiting for a scolding. "You didn't have to say that last night," I said, careful not to let it sound like an accusation. "I was fine letting them believe whatever they wanted." She sighed, an exhausted, brittle sound. "They've believed it for too long," she said. "And I'm tired of watching them look at you like you're a burden when you've been keeping this whole damn family from falling apart." Her words hit harder than I expected. Maybe because they were the first ones that came close to gratitude. Or maybe because they also came wrapped in guilt. I leaned against the counter and watched her scrub a plate that was already clean. "Why didn't you ever tell them? Why didn't you say anything before?" She turned off the water and finally looked at me. Her face looked older than I remembered, tired in places I hadn't noticed before. "Because your father and I made a mistake. We let Rick talk us into a deal that drained half our savings, and then we were too embarrassed to ask for help. When you offered, it felt like a lifeline, and like a failure." "You didn't fail," I said quietly. "No," she replied. "We just forgot how to be honest." I nodded, unsure what to say to that. For a moment, the silence returned, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was the kind that follows a deep breath. Before I could leave the room, she added one more thing. "Your cousin Sarah asked us to co-sign on a mortgage last month. She said she was inspired by how we held things together." I stared at her, stunned. "Did you?" She shook her head. "Not yet. But she thinks we will, and she thinks we can. Because she doesn't know we can't." The message was clear. The pattern was trying to repeat itself. But I wasn't going to let it. Not again. Not this time. And certainly not for Sarah. By the time the second dinner rolled around, the one we called leftovers night, but which always managed to be just as formal and awkward as the main event, I could already feel the tension pulsing under the surface like a current no one wanted to acknowledge. The table had been reset with almost the same place settings, the same cloth napkins folded into triangles, and the same hollow pleasantries about weather and traffic tossed back and forth, as if none of us remembered the nuclear bomb that had dropped in the dining room the night before. It was all so performative I half expected someone to cue a laugh track or pull out a clapperboard labeled Thanksgiving, Take 2. But I knew better. I knew my family. They didn't forget things. They just buried them under layers of niceties, sarcasm, and denial until the emotional landfill grew so high you couldn't see the truth underneath. That's how we operated. No apologies, no accountability, just silence and polite disapproval wrapped in the language of concern. What made it worse was how normal everyone was pretending to be. Sarah, in particular, was glowing with that particular brand of self-satisfaction that made my skin crawl. She had always been the darling of the family, the golden girl with the predictable life, college, engagement, small marketing job in a downtown building where she wore pencil skirts and posted filtered coffee photos on Instagram. She did everything in the right order, with the right accessories, and was praised for it constantly. And now she was the one giving toasts at leftover dinners, standing up with her wine glass lifted just enough to demand attention, smiling like she was about to hand out party favors. "I just want to say," she began, her tone syrupy and loud enough to cut through the conversations around her, "how grateful I am for family this year, especially Uncle Rick, who's been helping me get my financial ducks in a row. I've learned so much just by watching how our family supports each other. It's really inspiring." I couldn't stop the laugh that escaped me. It was sharp, a little too loud, and not the kind of laugh that invited others to join in. Every eye turned toward me, but I didn't flinch. I set down my glass and met Sarah's gaze, with the kind of calm that comes after you've stopped caring whether people find you agreeable. "You know what's funny about inspiration?" I said, slowly enough to make them lean in. "It usually works better when it's based on reality." Sarah's smile faltered just enough for me to see the panic crack the surface. She glanced at Uncle Rick, whose expression had gone stony, and then at my mother, who was watching me with the same unreadable face she wore whenever I stepped out of the carefully constructed role she needed me to play. I stood up, not dramatically, not to make a scene. I didn't raise my voice or slam anything. I simply walked to the sideboard where I had set my purse earlier and pulled out the manila folder I had been carrying since I left my bedroom that morning. The same folder filled with years' worth of documentation. Mortgage statements, utility bills, bank transfers, all of it. I walked back to the table and set it down gently in front of Sarah. "Since we're all so invested," I said, tapping the folder, "I thought I'd share what real support looks like." Uncle Rick leaned forward. "What is this?" "It's the last 4 years of me paying this family's bills, in full, on time, quietly, while being told I was a burden, a joke, a failed experiment. While listening to comments about my unstable lifestyle and how I couldn't hack it in the real world. While Sarah," I turned to look at her now, my voice still even, "was borrowing my financials to qualify for a loan she didn't earn." The room went quiet again, that same stunned, suffocating silence from the night before. But this time, no one could pretend they hadn't heard me. There was no misunderstanding, no wine-soaked confusion, just truth, exposed and undeniable. Sarah looked like she'd been slapped. I didn't borrow your financials. I just used you as a reference." I laughed again, this time without even trying to soften the edge. "A reference. Sarah, your pre-approval paperwork listed joint assets. Assets that only exist because I've been covering this house's debt. Your mortgage broker called me last week to confirm income levels. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Or did you think I'd be too polite to say anything?" She started to say something, probably a lie or a deflection or another saccharine excuse, but I cut her off with a raised hand. I wasn't interested in whatever spin she had prepared. I was done being the quiet one. My father cleared his throat, the sound thin and brittle. "Claire, maybe we should talk about this privately." "No," I said, firmly. "We've done enough private. Everything in this house has been swept under the rug so long we're all walking on a pile of unpaid debts and bad decisions. And I'm tired of pretending my silence is kindness. It's not, it's compliance." Rick opened his mouth, probably to defend himself or deflect the blame, but I was faster. "You lost our father's savings with that real estate scam, Rick. You begged Mom and Dad to cover it, and when they couldn't, you disappeared until they defaulted. I'm the one who kept them from losing this house, not you, and certainly not Sarah." The air in the room turned thick, like it had weight. No one moved. No one spoke. My mother finally looked up from her untouched plate, and her eyes met mine with something I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shame. It was closer to relief, like a weight she had carried alone had finally been shared. I didn't stay much longer. I gathered my things, told my parents I'd call in a few days, and walked out before anyone could follow me. I didn't want apologies. I didn't need them. They would be hollow anyway, reflexive rather than sincere. I didn't care about repairing whatever image had shattered across that table. I only cared that I had said what needed to be said, that I had finally spoken not for their benefit, but for mine. And as I got into my car, pulling away from the house I had once called home, I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel bitter. I felt free. It was astonishing how quickly a family could recalibrate its tone once the facade had been shattered in public. After years of being talked over, pitied, and dismissed with the backhanded sweetness that only family could manage, it took exactly one moment of exposure, one truth spoken at the right pitch and the right temperature for the entire hierarchy to tremble. In the days following what I now jokingly referred to in my head as the folder incident, the phone calls came in waves, though not from the people who had been loudest at the dinner table. Rick, to no one's surprise, went radio silent. Sarah sent a single text filled with the kind of faux perky language that's only used when someone is deeply uncomfortable and trying to claw their way back to neutral ground. She thanked me vaguely for clarifying everything and said she hoped we could circle back after the holidays with fresh energy. I didn't respond. Not because I was being vindictive, but because there was simply nothing to say. Some bridges don't burn, they evaporate. But it was my parents who sat heavy in my mind, especially my mother, who had yet to reach out with anything resembling follow-up. She hadn't defended me after the confrontation, but she hadn't condemned me either. She had just watched it happen, stone-faced, like someone witnessing a long overdue execution, not celebrating it, but not stopping it either. My father had called once, left a brief voicemail, mumbled something about feelings running high and maybe too much wine, but I knew better than to lean into that kind of retreat. They weren't reaching out because they were afraid. They were processing the fact that I had taken back control of the story, and with it, the power they had quietly been wielding over me for years. Still, I couldn't let it rest. Not entirely. The wound might have been opened, but it needed to be cleaned. There were things I needed to understand, things I hadn't dared ask back when I was too busy helping to bother with clarity. So I drove back to the house 2 days later, unannounced, like they used to do with me when I lived out of state, and they'd show up just passing through, pretending surprise when I didn't have a roast in the oven and guest towels ironed. When I walked in, my father was watching television, though he muted it the second he saw me. My mother was in the kitchen, wiping down a countertop that had no crumbs. The place was eerily quiet. No music, no cooking, just the awkward hum of people living in a house built on secrets. I didn't sit down. I didn't offer pleasantries. I asked my questions straight out. When exactly did you start using the money I sent to help Rick? The silence that followed wasn't shocked. It was resigned. My father stood slowly, walked into the kitchen, and leaned against the door frame. My mother didn't turn around immediately. She kept wiping the counter, slower now, as if scrubbing the memory away required extra effort. When she finally faced me, I saw it in her eyes. Shame. Not just guilt, but the deeper, more suffocating kind that settles in when someone realizes their lie wasn't just exposed, it was understood. It started the second year, she said, voice quiet but steady. We were making the mortgage again. Things were stable, but Rick came to us, said he was weeks away from bankruptcy. He promised to pay it back. He said it was just to hold him over, and your father, he couldn't say no. I never agreed to that, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. That money was for you, for this house. You looked me in the eye and told me you needed help. You didn't tell me I was bailing out a man who publicly insults me. I know, my father said then, stepping forward. And I let it happen. I didn't stop it. I thought, if we could keep the family together, if Rick could just stabilize, it would be worth it. I didn't think it would snowball. But it did, I said. Didn't it? My mother nodded. Every time we helped him, he came back with another reason, another shortfall, another failed venture. And all the while, he was feeding you to the wolves at those dinners, knowing full well you were the reason we weren't underwater. It hit me then, not just how deep the betrayal ran, but how willingly they had all participated in the erasure. It wasn't just Rick. It wasn't just Sarah. My own parents had rewritten the truth, cloaked it in silence, and handed it off to the family as gospel. They'd let me be misunderstood, diminished, even mocked, because the lie was easier than the embarrassment. And I had allowed it, unknowingly at first, then reluctantly, then bitterly, because the cost of telling the truth always felt higher than the reward. Until now. I need you to understand something, I said, finally taking a seat at the kitchen table, pressing my palms flat against the wood as if to ground myself in what came next. I'm not going to continue paying for this house if I can't trust where the money is going. That means no more side deals, no more quiet favors, no more shame-based charity to a man who has made it his hobby to humiliate me in front of people who barely know me. We understand, my mother said quickly. Almost too quickly, but I wasn't finished. And from this point forward, I want my name on the deed. That stopped her. Her hands froze mid-gesture, and her face tensed in that tight, practiced way she had mastered from decades of hosting dinner parties with enemies. My father looked surprised, but not angry. He looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for me to take ownership of what had already, in truth, been mine. You want to own the house? She asked carefully. I already do, practically. This just makes it legal. My mother swallowed. And if we say no, then the payments stop, and the next dinner won't be about gratitude, it'll be about foreclosure. There was no need to raise my voice, no need to dramatize it. The facts were sharp enough. The deal was plain. They could choose pride, or they could choose a roof over their heads. I knew which they'd pick. They had made that decision once before. Only this time, I was setting the terms. We sat in silence after that, the three of us orbiting around a new reality, one where I wasn't the afterthought or the savior or the cautionary tale. I was the one making the rules. Later that evening, just before I left, my mother stopped me at the door. Her hand brushed my shoulder, a gesture that would have felt comforting if it hadn't come so late. You're not wrong, Claire, she said softly. But just know, when you change the terms of the story, you don't just get the truth. You get all the consequences, too. And with that, she closed the door behind me. I stood on the porch for a long time after that, the chill in the air biting at my fingertips, and I thought about what she said. The interest was compounding, but so was my strength. The final conversation didn't happen over a phone call or through a text, nor did it unfold across a kitchen table or living room couch like so many of our past misunderstandings had been swept under. It took place at the attorney's office. Neutral ground, fluorescent lighting, a long mahogany table polished to an artificial gleam that smelled like wood polish and formality. It was just me, my parents, and a notary with the politeness of someone who had learned to stay detached from the kinds of family dynamics that unravel behind notarized signatures. My parents had agreed reluctantly but clearly to have the deed amended, and while they didn't fight me on it, the silence that hovered between us said everything their words refused to admit. They didn't want to give up control, but they knew they no longer deserved to have it. They had spent too many years depending on my silence, too many months trusting that my sense of duty would outweigh my sense of self-respect. And now that the balance had tipped, they understood there would be no going back. When I signed my name on that line, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt tired, like someone finally dropping a weight they had carried for miles longer than necessary. The power was never really in the house. It was in the truth, and I had finally laid claim to both. As I slid the folder across the table to the notary, I saw my mother's eyes flicker to the papers, not with anger, but with something closer to resignation. My father didn't look at the documents at all. Instead, he stared down at his folded hands, like he was waiting for someone to dismiss the entire thing as a misunderstanding. Afterward, we didn't go out for coffee. We didn't hug or reminisce. We walked to our cars in silence, and I told them I'd be in touch with an updated bill for utilities and maintenance estimates, along with the new guidelines I expected to be followed. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even cruel. It was structure, and it was long overdue. If I was going to be the one holding the net beneath this family, then I was going to be the one who set the height of the safety bar. I gave them a week to adjust before I attended the next family gathering, a birthday celebration for my cousin Josh. whose entire existence seemed to revolve around microbreweries, fantasy football, and starting conversations with the phrase, "not to be political, but..." I went not because I was feeling sentimental or even particularly generous, but because I needed to see what came next. After everything that had been revealed, after every mask had dropped and every secret had come into the light, I wanted to witness the reconstruction. Or if it couldn't be rebuilt, I wanted to be sure I was no longer a part of whatever shaky scaffolding they tried to prop up instead. The party was held at a rented event hall, sterile, brightly lit, with plastic folding chairs and generic banners strung along the wall that read, "Happy 35th Josh." Like that milestone mattered more than the years we had all spent pretending we liked one another. Most of the family was there, and while no one said anything directly, the energy was different. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't pitied. I wasn't praised either, which would have been worse. I was treated with that awkward mixture of deference and distance, like a distant cousin who had won the lottery and might be considering who gets a cut. Sarah approached me cautiously, holding a paper plate stacked with cake and pretzels, wearing a smile that tried too hard to look natural. She stood beside me for a long moment before speaking, which was already unusual for her. "I heard about the deed," she said finally, her voice light but careful. I nodded. "I figured you would." She hesitated again. "I didn't mean to put you in a position where you had to do all that." "You didn't," I said, meeting her eyes. "That was already the position I was in. You just assumed I'd stay in it without asking for anything back." Sarah shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I guess I thought if it was family, it didn't count like that." I took a sip of water, buying myself a moment to decide whether I wanted to keep this civil or honest. I chose both, which was always the hardest route. "That's the lie we all like to tell ourselves," I said. "That if it's for family, it's not a debt. But the truth is, emotional IOUs still accrue interest. They just do it in silence." Sarah didn't have a response to that. She just nodded slowly and walked back toward her table, probably rehearsing how she'd describe the interaction later to her fiancé, who still called me the tech girl. I stayed for another hour, long enough to see that the narrative had shifted. No one mocked me. No one asked invasive questions about my relationship status or career. No one tried to minimize what had happened. They didn't exactly celebrate me either, but that wasn't what I had come for. I had come to confirm that the version of myself they once believed in, the one they dismissed and talked over and pitied, was gone, and she wasn't coming back. As I left, I walked past the table where my mother sat, politely laughing at something someone had said. She glanced up as I passed and reached out to lightly brush my wrist, the smallest gesture of recognition, maybe even gratitude. But she didn't speak. I didn't either. Some things don't need to be said when you finally have the upper hand. That night, back at my place, I poured myself a drink and opened my laptop to check emails. Buried between 2 client updates and a newsletter I never subscribed to was a message from a private investment firm. They had heard about my consulting work through channels I could trace if I tried, and were interested in acquiring my firm, or at the very least offering a merger with equity that could turn my already quiet success into something much louder. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at the offer, the figures, the potential, and felt the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The irony was beautiful. The moment my family finally saw what I was worth, the world outside had already seen it, and they were ready to pay what I was truly owed. As I sat there in the glow of my computer screen, I realized something simple and freeing. Respect isn't something you get by waiting for people to hand it to you. Sometimes you have to write your own contract, and then you make damn sure they sign it.